My name is Angela, and I worked in corporate accounting. I was 34 years old when I died in a Walmart parking lot in Columbus, Ohio. Not exactly the place you'd expect to meet Jesus, but that's exactly what happened. I died, and what he showed me in the time between my last breath and the moment I came back, I have not been able to stop thinking about it for 3 years. Not a single day. And I need to tell you what he showed me, because I made a promise that I would. It was a Tuesday in March. I was driving home from a work lunch when a delivery truck ran a red light and hit my driver's side door going about 45 miles an hour. That's it. That fast. 1 second I was reaching for my coffee. Next second, nothing. No transition. No tunnel yet. Just nothing. And then, somewhere completely else. The first thing I noticed was that I was standing somewhere that felt solid. More solid than anything I had ever stood on. Like the ground itself was certainty. Not just physical stability. Certainty. Like standing on the most real thing that has ever existed. And there was light. But not from a sun or a lamp or a source I could identify. It was just present. Like the light was the atmosphere of wherever this was. And he was there. I knew immediately. I didn't need an introduction. I didn't need to ask a single question. It's hard to explain, but there was a knowing that came with being near him that bypassed thought entirely. Like recognition at a level underneath language. He looked at me, and he just said my name. Angela. And I completely fell apart. Not from fear. Not from shock. From something I genuinely do not have the right word for. It was like relief, but bigger than relief. Like I had been homesick my entire life for a place I had never been, and I had just arrived. That's the closest I can get. He let me stand there for a moment. He didn't rush anything. And then he said, I want to show you something. Something about wisdom. Because you have been confused about it your whole life, and you are not alone. Most people are. And before I could respond, we were somewhere else. We were standing in what looked like an ancient city. I don't know how else to describe it. Stone buildings. Narrow streets. The air felt different, drier, older somehow. And it was busy. There were people everywhere, moving through market stalls, carrying goods, talking. I looked at Jesus and said, Where are we? He said, Jerusalem. About 3,000 years ago. I want you to see something. He walked and I followed him through the street until we stopped outside a building. Not a palace exactly, but official looking. Important. And inside, through an open doorway, I could see a man sitting at a low table. He was writing. Carefully, deliberately, on what looked like papyrus. The room was quiet compared to the chaos of the street outside. Jesus said, Watch him. So I watched. The man wrote slowly. He wasn't composing on the fly. He was choosing each word like it weighed something. Like every choice mattered. I asked, Who is he? A scribe. A collector. Jesus said. He spent his entire life gathering observations, short sayings, patterns he noticed in how the world works. Moral compass needles, you might call them. He's been waiting his whole life to write this opening. Because he knows what is about to write is going to reframe everything that comes after it. I said, What is he writing? Jesus smiled and said, The prologue to Proverbs. We stood there watching this man write. And then Jesus did something unexpected. He pointed to the papyrus and the words seemed to become visible to me, like I could read them even from a distance, even in a language I had never studied. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Jesus said, Notice what that doesn't say. I looked at it. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be noticing. He said, It doesn't say the commandments of Solomon. It doesn't say the laws of Solomon. It says Proverbs. That word, in Hebrew, mishle, comes from a root word that means to compare, to place alongside. A proverb isn't a command handed down from someone with authority over you. It's a comparison. It's a mirror. He turned to face me fully. A command tells you what to do. A mirror shows you what is real. Those are two completely different things. And most people have been reading this book like it's a list of commands their whole lives and completely missing what it actually is. I thought about how I had always read Proverbs. scattered verses on motivational posters, a 7-chapter practical guide, a collection of good advice you could apply or ignore based on whether it felt relevant that day. I told him that. He nodded and said, "Exactly. And that is why it has never really changed anything for you. You were using a mirror as a rule book. They don't function the same way." We kept walking through the city. Jesus moved through the crowd like no one found it strange that he was there, and I followed, trying to keep up. We stopped at a well in the middle of a courtyard. People were coming and going, filling jars, talking, arguing. And Jesus sat down on the edge of it and looked at me like we were just two people having a conversation, which I suppose we were. He said, "Tell me something. What do you think wisdom is?" Honestly. I said what I'd always assumed. Being educated, knowing a lot, making good decisions based on experience, being smart about life, figuring things out. He listened to the whole thing and then said, "That's what most people in your time think. And that's exactly the problem. Because by that definition, the most educated, most successful, most capable people on the planet should also be the wisest. And Angela, look around you. Is that what you see?" I didn't say anything because the answer was obvious. He said, Proverbs 1, verse 7. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Now, what do you think fear means in that sentence? I said I always thought it meant being scared of God, afraid of punishment, like divine consequences keeping you in line. He looked at me with this patience that didn't feel like patience because I had to. It felt like patience because he genuinely wanted me to understand. He said, "The Hebrew word is yirah. And yirah is not what happens when you see something dangerous. There's a different Hebrew word for that, pakhad. That's the fear of a lion, a survival response. Yirah is something else entirely." He stood up and pointed out across the courtyard. "You see that man over there?" He pointed to an older man who had just walked into the square. The people around him clearly knew him. There was a shift in the atmosphere around him. People made room, not from fear, but from something like reverence. A few nodded deeply when he passed. Jesus said, "The people in that courtyard aren't scared of him, but they recognize that they are in the presence of someone who carries something they don't fully have yet. That recognition, that's closer to yirah. It's what you feel when you're standing in the presence of something so much greater than you that your sense of yourself becomes properly sized. Not destroyed, not crushed, just accurately sized." He sat back down. "And here's why it matters," he said. "Yirah is the posture of the soul that makes it possible to see reality correctly. Without it, everything you perceive is distorted. Not imperfect, distorted. Because you are looking at the world through a lens that puts yourself at the center, and that lens was never built to show you the truth. It lies. It was always going to lie." I sat down across from him at the edge of the well. Something about sitting there with him in the middle of this ancient city felt completely natural. Like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. He said, "The verse says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The Hebrew word for knowledge there is diyat, raw perception, awareness. The basic ability to recognize what is actually real. And the text is saying that without yirah, that basic perception is broken. You cannot even see correctly without this foundation. The data itself is corrupted." That landed in a way I was not prepared for, because I had always assumed perception was neutral. That smart people just saw more clearly. That more education equaled clearer vision. He was saying the lens itself was the problem. He said, later in Proverbs Chapter 9, verse 10, the text says the fear of the Lord is also the beginning of wisdom. Hokmah in Hebrew. That's the bigger, more developed concept. But the compiler starts here, at this earlier, more basic level. Diyat, perception. Because you cannot build wisdom on a foundation of broken perception. You cannot construct something true from information that is already distorted. We sat there at that well for what felt like a long time. And then he said, "Come on. I want to show you something else." We left the courtyard and walked back into the main street. And we stopped in front of what looked like some kind of workshop. Through the open front I could see a man working with his hands, carving, fitting pieces together. Skilled. precise, focused. Whatever he was building was intricate. Jesus said, "What do you think he has?" I said, "Skill. He's clearly very good at what he does." Jesus nodded. In Hebrew that would be called hokmah, the same word used for wisdom, skill, expertise, the ability to see patterns and execute on them. The craftsmen who built the tabernacle, God's dwelling place in the wilderness, they had hokmah. Their skill was described with that exact word. He paused and then pointed down the street to someone else. A man who was talking to a small group, and even from where we were standing, there was something a little off about the interaction. A little too smooth. The listeners were nodding, but something in their faces said they weren't quite sure why. Jesus said, "The manipulators of Egypt, the ones who matched Moses' miracles sign for sign, they had hokmah too. A brilliant con artist has hokmah. Someone who is an expert at exploiting people has hokmah. It is not inherently moral. It is just skill. Just capability. It can be used for anything." He turned back to me. "So what transforms hokmah from a tool into an actual virtue? What changes it from raw capability into something that serves what is real and right?" I said I didn't know. He said, "Yirah. That reverential awe of God. That's the only thing that changes it. That's the only thing that orients skill toward justice rather than just efficiency. That's the only thing that makes intelligence genuinely wise instead of just effective." He said, "Angela, this is the crisis of your generation. Your world is full of the most educated, most capable, most information-saturated people who have ever existed. And so much of that capability is being used to exploit, to manipulate, to gain advantage, to accumulate. Because intelligence without yirah serves the self. It was always going to serve the self. The foundation is wrong." He started walking again and I followed. We moved through narrower streets, quieter ones, and eventually came out onto a hillside overlooking the whole city. Jerusalem spread out below us, and I remember standing there thinking, even in the middle of all this, that it was beautiful. Complicated and chaotic and beautiful. Jesus sat down on the hillside and looked out over the city and said, "Let me show you the architecture. Because verse 7 isn't just a nice verse. It's a structural claim about how reality is built." He picked up a small stone from the ground and held it. Think about a building. Any building. Wisdom, real wisdom, the whole developed thing, is the structure. The walls, the rooms, the roof. Everything that makes the building useful and livable. The practical advice, the good decisions, the right choices. That's the building. He set the stone down on the ground. But yirah is not the first brick. It's not even the foundation layer. It's the ground itself. The ground that makes the foundation possible. You can build a very impressive structure on the wrong ground. It can look solid for years, decades even. But eventually, always, without exception, it collapses. Because what's underneath it was never capable of holding it. He looked at me. "How many people do you know who built impressive lives on the wrong ground?" I didn't answer out loud, but the list in my head was not short, including myself. He said, "This is why the scribe down there is beginning the way he's beginning. He's not writing a self-help text. He's establishing the operating system before any of the applications get installed. He's saying all of this practical wisdom I'm about to give you, it only functions if you understand what it's resting on." He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city. And then he said, "I want to show you something that happened before this city existed." And we were somewhere different. A garden. Not like any garden I had seen before. Not manicured or contained. Just alive. Dense and real and full of something that felt like untouched intention. Like everything in it was exactly what it was meant to be. And there were two people. A man and a woman. And they were standing in front of a tree. I knew immediately what I was looking at. Jesus stood beside me and said quietly, "Most people think this story is about a rule being broken. About disobedience. About God saying don't do this thing and humans doing it anyway." We watched. The woman reached toward the tree. The man stood close. Jesus said, "It's deeper than that. The temptation here is not ignorance. They're not being offered more information. They're being offered wisdom, hokmah, without yirah. The ability to know good and evil, to choose and discern, but on their own terms. Without submitting that ability to God. Without the posture of reverence. We watched them take the fruit. And the change was immediate. Even from where we were standing, something shifted in them. Something that had been open closed. Something that had been clear became clouded. They looked at each other, and in their faces I could see shame rising where there had been none before. They looked toward where God was, and they hid. Jesus said, the lens broke the moment they removed it from its proper foundation. Their perception was immediately distorted. They could still see. They had the knowledge. But it was knowledge filtered through a broken lens. And every decision they made after that, and every decision made by every generation since, has been made with that same corrupted perception. He looked at me. This is not ancient history, Angela. This is still happening. Every person on your planet is making decisions with that corrupted lens unless they have addressed the foundation. Unless yirah has been restored as the ground. That's what Proverbs 1 is about. That's what it was always about. It's not a book of tips for living. It's a repair manual for the lens. We were back on the hillside in Jerusalem. Just like that. He said, now I want to tell you about the fool. Because this is the part most people are not comfortable with. In verse 7 of Proverbs 1, the fool is introduced. The Hebrew word is evil, not the English word evil, but the Hebrew word evil. And the defining characteristic of this fool is not a lack of intelligence. The fool is not stupid. The fool is not uneducated. The fool is not lacking access. The fool sees wisdom and chooses not to receive it. The Hebrew word for despise in that verse is baz. It means to look at something and decide it has no value. To dismiss it. It's an active choice. The fool is not someone who cannot know. The fool is someone who decides not to. He looked at me directly. And Angela, I need to ask you something. How many times in your life have you seen wisdom, in scripture, in a person wiser than you, in a circumstance that was clearly showing you something, and said, I don't care, not worth my time, I know better. I didn't answer for a second. And then I said, a lot. He said, that's not an intellectual failure. That's a moral choice. And in the architecture of Proverbs, that choice has entirely predictable consequences. Not primarily as punishment sent from outside. As consequences woven into the structure of reality itself. The world was built a certain way. If you act against that structure consistently, the structure pushes back. Not because I am sending a judgment every time, but because that is simply how the world was made. He said, the fool speaks without thinking and creates conflict. The fool rejects correction and suffers for it. The fool is arrogant and eventually falls into ruin. These are not random punishments. They are built-in outcomes. Proverbs is revealing the grain of the wood. If you cut with the grain, things go well. If you cut against it, consistently, deliberately, over time, the results are entirely predictable. He stood up and we walked further along the hillside, and he started connecting things I had never connected in my entire life of nominally reading a Bible. He said, the Psalms. You know Psalm 25? Teach me your ways, Lord. Teach me your paths. Show me. Do you notice the posture in that? The psalmist is not asking for more intelligence. He's not asking for better information. He's asking to be made capable of receiving. To be made open. That is yirah in action. That is the same posture Proverbs 1 is calling for. Psalm 111, verse 10 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Same word, same architecture. The psalmist is saying the same thing the compiler of Proverbs is saying. This is not one author's quirk. This is the consistent testimony of the entire tradition. He said, Job. Do you know Job? The whole book. I said I knew the general story, but not well. He said, Job is an entire book about what happens when genuine wisdom that is truly rooted in reverence, hits a wall it cannot think its way past. And here's what people miss about Job. He was not a fool. The very first verse of that book says he feared God and turned away from evil. He had yirah. He was genuinely righteous. but his intelligence could not explain what was happening to him. And the book forces the question that Proverbs 1 sets up. Is there a wisdom beyond the kind you can reason your way to? And the answer the book gives is yes. And accessing it requires a posture of humility that goes even deeper than what Job initially had. Even genuinely wise people have to keep going deeper. He said, and Moses, Deuteronomy, I set before you today life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. That is the same architecture. You have the capacity to choose. But only one choice is wise. And it requires submitting to God. That is not a rule imposed from outside. That is a description of how reality functions. He stopped walking and turned to face me. And when I walked the earth the first time, I taught in parables. Comparisons. Stories that required openness to receive. Not raw intelligence. Not education. Openness. Matthew 11 verse 25. I praise the Father for hiding these things from the wise and the learned and revealing them to little children. Do you know why I said that? I said I had always found that verse confusing. He said, because the wise and the learned of that time had made their intelligence the foundation. They had built their whole understanding of God and Scripture and reality on their own capacity to reason. They were closed. They had no room to receive anything that didn't fit the structure they had already built. The children had no such structure. They were open. And that openness is yirah. That is the only posture that makes receiving possible. A locked room cannot be filled no matter how much you try to pour in. We sat back down and he said something that I still feel in my chest when I think about it. He said, the world you come from teaches one thing above everything else. It says trust yourself. Believe in your own reasoning. The answer is inside you. You have everything you need. And Angela, that is the oldest lie in existence. It is the same thing the serpent said in the garden. You can know on your own. You do not need God for that. You can be the foundation. And billions of people are living out the consequences of believing it. They are educated, capable, more informed than any generation that has ever existed. They have access to more knowledge than Solomon could have dreamed of. And they are making catastrophic decisions. Their intelligence is not saving them. Because intelligence without yirah is a building without ground. It looks solid. It holds for a while. And then it doesn't. Proverbs is not a self-help book. He said. It is the opposite of a self-help book. Every self-help book says the answer is inside you. Proverbs says the beginning, the reshit, the very ground, is not inside you. It is in God. But it is not withheld from you. It is the most available thing in existence. The only requirement is the posture. The willingness to be properly sized. The willingness to say, there is something bigger than me, and I'm going to submit my intelligence to it instead of making my intelligence the foundation. That is what separates knowledge from wisdom. Not volume. Not capacity. Posture. I don't know how long we were there. Time felt completely different in that place. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 20 years. It didn't matter. I was not tired. I was not hungry. I was just present, in a way I had never been present in my entire life before. Then he said simply, it's time for you to go back. I told him I didn't want to. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to lose the clarity and peace I was feeling. I finally understood what it meant to stand on a foundation that actually held. He said, you won't lose it if you choose not to. That is the invitation of Proverbs 1. You can live from this foundation, but you must choose it every day. The world will tell you that your intelligence is enough, that you don't need yirah, that reverence is a weakness. Don't believe it. Then he told me, tell them what I showed you. The fool isn't someone who lacks intelligence. The fool is someone who sees wisdom and says, I don't care. That is a choice people make every day without realizing it. Finally, he said, read Proverbs 1 slowly. Then ask yourself, where am I choosing not to know? Where am I trusting my own intelligence instead of submitting it to something greater? Don't rush to answer. It's a question you must live with. I was back in my body before I finished the thought. I won't spend time on the recovery. Hospital, injuries, weeks of physical therapy. None of that is the point. I came back, and the details of coming back are not what matters. What matters is what I carried back with me. I have read Proverbs 1 nearly 200 times since that day. And every time, I see something I missed before. I'm learning to read it as a mirror, not a rule book. To approach it with yirah as the foundation instead of trusting my own intelligence. 3 years later, I understand what Jesus showed me. Those 7 verses contain a message that echoes throughout the Bible. Human knowledge is valuable. It is a gift. But it is not enough. It must be rooted in something greater than itself. That posture is yirah. It is simply recognizing that God is the ground and I am the building. The fool rejects that. The wise person stays open. They keep listening. They never decide their own intelligence is sufficient. That is what Proverbs 1 taught me. And that is what Jesus showed me in the space between my death and my life. I promised him I would tell people. So now I have.